Great. Welcome. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. This talk is called Ready Filter Action, but I could just as easily have called it Everything You Wanted to Know About WordPress Hooks, but we're afraid to ask. If you want to follow along, you can go to amandagiles.com/Cape Cod 2019, and that'll give you a link to the slides for later or for now. So I decided to go with a hook theme in here, so hopefully that'll keep us amused at least. We're going to talk about what hooks are. We're going to talk about why you want to use them. We're going to talk about the two different types of hooks that WordPress has, how they work, go over some syntax and some examples. We'll talk a little bit about creating your own hooks, also some functions for checking for and removing them, and then reference links at the end, which again, if you visit the slides, you'll be able to click those links and follow up with some more information. So just a little bit about me. Jean kind of covered some of this, but I've been a programmer all my life. I started with BASIC and Logo back in the 80s. I made my first website in college in '94. So I've been professionally coding for over 20 years. Not always websites, but I got into websites in the last 15 years or so. Been working for myself since 2006 and with WordPress since 2009. So this is like my 10-year anniversary with WordPress. I started the Seacoast, New Hampshire WordPress Meetup in 2011. So we meet just south of Portsmouth. That's a trek from here, but if you ever find yourself up in the area. And I co-created Spark Development, which is a 4-member agency just focused on WordPress development. So. And I was actually invited by Matt to read a poem about WordPress at the State of the Word in 2017. So that's my token picture with Matt Mullenweg. He was kind enough to take after. So the biggest question people often have, of course, is what is a hook? We kind of hear this term thrown around. You've probably used some if you've done some coding and maybe not even realized it. But a hook is an event or essentially a point in time within WordPress code that essentially allows for other code to be run. So developers of WordPress core, plugins, and even themes can create hooks in their code at specific points. And if you've used a theme like Genesis, you've seen a lot of hooks. But even if you've just used a child theme and written, a function to enqueue your styles or scripts, you've probably used a hook, even if you didn't fully understand that at the time. This is my favorite real life example of what is a hook. Last call at a bar, the bartender says, "Hey, we're closing. Are there any orders that anybody needs?" And everybody puts in their order, and the bartender fills all of the orders. That's exactly how a hook works in WordPress. It's a point in time in the code where the developer who wrote the code essentially gives you a space to do something. Says, "Hey, at this point, I'm going to check if there's something you want me to run now," essentially in between some other things. It could be an action, or it could be a piece of data that you're allowed to look at and maybe manipulate. So just like with the last call example, the nice thing about hooks too is that more than one function can be associated with them. There can actually be 0 functions associated with a hook, but you can have multiple functions associated with a hook. So for instance, a hook in WordPress might be called, and there might be no other code on the site that does anything when that hook is called, so it just comes and goes. Or it could be a hook that the theme also looks at, and maybe some of your plugins are also running functions on that same hook, that same point in time. And to help deal with that, you can also give these functions a priority. So when you link a function to a hook, which we'll look at more in a second, you can also give it a priority so that you can force your function to run before or after another function on the site. The main reason that we use hooks in WordPress are so that you can directly edit the code that other people write. I'm sorry, not directly edit. That's what we're trying to avoid. If you really wanted the code to do something, sure enough, you could open WordPress and you could hack it to do what you really want it to do on a site, but then what would happen with that? the next time you updated WordPress, you would completely lose all of that code. Same thing with a plugin if it didn't do quite what you wanted. So hooks are actually specifically placed to allow you to customize the functionality of WordPress or a plugin without directly editing the code. And they're essentially the proper way to alter the behavior of things. Unfortunately, there's not always a hook where you want, but WordPress in general is really good about hooks. And most, I want to say proper plugins, most plugins that are solid and well supported have a lot of these hooks specifically so that you can edit them and essentially change how they're functioning in certain ways. But it's totally up to the developer whether or not they put these hooks in. I alluded to this already, but there's two types of hooks in WordPress. One is an action hook that just is the most basic one. It allows you to run code at a certain point in time. And some of the examples in WordPress where this happens are during initialization, before the main query is run that pulls all your posts, also in the header or the footer of your pages and posts. And action hooks, again, they just allow something to happen. Filter hooks are similar. They have the same process in that they run at a certain point in time, but a filter hook is actually going to allow you to alter some information. So you might have the chance to alter the content or alter a text, or you can alter, for instance, the query arguments of what your query is running when it's pulling up posts. So they're a little more complex than action hooks. They still get called the same way. They still give you a point in time where you can run your code, but they'll actually let you manipulate the data. And you can look at that data and maybe choose to do nothing, or you can pass back different data, or you might transform the data in some way. One of the key things with filter hooks is that you have to remember to pass that data back unless you're intentionally trying to wipe it out. So action hooks are just kind of one-off. They go somewhere, they don't return anything, but a filter hook is actually lets you manipulate some data. So some of these examples include, like I mentioned, content. So if you wanted to change content, page and post titles, widget titles, before saving content. I mean, just about anywhere where you have some kind of parameters or content data, you can possibly have a hook in there. So there's essentially three pieces to how an action hook works. The first piece is that somebody has to create the hook. And literally to create the hook, all they do in their code is put this do_action function up here at the top. And this is the name of the hook. So in this case, do action WP_logout. That's the hook that WordPress core code has that executes when somebody goes to log out. So as soon as they put that in, they have essentially created this hook. That's all they've done. They've said, we're creating this hook with this string. There isn't anything more to it on their end. Now on your end, if you want to do something at that point in time, if you want to do something when a user logs out, what you're going to do is you're going to do two things. You're going to write a function that runs for that hook, and you're going to add this, you're going to put this add action statement in where you pass the same hook name and then the name of your function. So you have to both write the function to do whatever you want, and then you use this add action statement to tell WordPress that your function should be run when this hook is called. These three things make up essentially the entire hook cycle, except that you can actually have, as I mentioned, you could have multiple sets of functions. Each time you have a function, you would need to hook it in to the hook again, even if it's the same hook. If it's just you, obviously you wouldn't necessarily write in multiple functions. You'd probably just write one. But my point being that like each plugin on your website could be doing something when a user logs out or logs in. So we'll look at the specific syntax, but you get the idea here of the way those pieces fall together. Questions so far? Good? Yeah?
The WP_logout action,
yep.
Is that just a declared action? There's no function called WP logout, it's just...
Correct. So in WordPress, this do action, that is essentially the creation of the hook. That's all it takes. So WordPress core just has that hook name in there, and then it's up to you if you want something to happen when that statement runs, when a user logs out, then you can essentially link your code to it. Rich?
Now, I've seen it done both ways. I don't know if it's just the best practice thing, but adding the action before the function or after the function.
Oh, yeah.
Is just the best practice.
You know, there is a code handbook, and I don't know if there is a proper way. I've seen it both ways. I tend to like to put it after. In this example, I put it before, just so you could kind of see the do action next to the add action. It doesn't affect how it functions either way. So the two pieces that you're putting in, the function and your add action, you don't even have to put them in the same file. I've seen some themes where the function is in one file, and then there's another file where they have all of their add action, add filter. And in one sense, that's simpler to read, because you could see all of the similar hooks together and see what order they run. On the other hand, if you're looking in the code and you look at this other function, when you're looking at it, you may have no idea when it's running. I mean, hopefully there'll be a comment to tell you that, but so you don't have to put them in the same file. They can be in whatever order. But yeah, there probably is a preference somewhere in the handbook, but it works either way.
Yeah, just thinking of JavaScript, seeing the function after it's called, I know that's going to be an error.
Right.
JavaScript includes function foisting, so all the functions are foisting from the beginning.
That's true. Yeah.
Function, it's an expression, not a declaration.
Right.
I don't know if PHP includes function foisting.
So just for the video, the discussion offline was just about JavaScript and how JavaScript can hoist functions up front. So let's just break down this syntax a little bit. So the action hooks, as I talk through, they get called with the hook name, but they can also additionally pass content if they want. You can pass data to an action hook. Even though an action hook doesn't return data like a filter hook does, you can still pass certain information in. So so if you have a hook name and the developer decides it's relevant for you to have other information, like maybe the current post object or some other information. If the user's logging out, it's possible that you get past a user object. So if that happens, those arguments just go after the hook name. And again, that's all on the developer side. So you don't really have any choice about this. Unfortunately, you can't decide, I really need a hook at this point in the code. It's incumbent upon the developer who wrote the code to put the hook in for you. But they might, in addition to having the hook, actually pass you data as well that you can receive then in your function and process. So on your side, you have the add action, you have your hook name and your function name. Then you can have a priority, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So the default priority in WordPress is 10. So if you just say add action and you stop after the hook name and the function name, you are going to be priority 10 and one argument coming in. But if you have more than one argument or you want to change the priority, you can add that third or fourth parameter when you make that add action call. Sometimes you don't care about the arguments that are being passed to the function, so you don't have to say how many arguments there are if you're not going to pay any attention to them. But if you want to access them, you do need to include all 4 arguments then, so that you have the number of arguments at the end there. Filter hooks are similar, obviously, except that instead of do action like we have with the action hooks, we have apply filters. So it's a little bit different terminology, but otherwise it's essentially the same idea. So we have apply filters here. For this example, this is the excerpt length. So this is, WordPress has this hook. It lets you change how many characters are in, or how many words, I believe. Words, thank you. How many words are in the excerpt, and it defaults to 55. So this is actually what the code looks like in WordPress core if you were to look for it. And what that means is that we can add our own function, and you can see here I did actually swap now where I did the add filter. We use add filter to once again, take the hook name and then link it to our function name, in this case, custom excerpt length. So I'm changing it to 20. I don't even care. So I get this 55 passed in the length parameter, but I'm just returning my own value. I'm just overwriting it. And I want to make sure that I'm the last word in what happens, so I've actually put my priority as 999. So if the default priority is 10, certainly somebody else could put a hook in that's 99999 or 1000 or 1001, and they would happen after me. But obviously putting in the 999 is me trying to be at the very end of the stack, so that no matter how many other times one of my plugins may have changed the excerpt length, I'm just essentially trying to have the final word. But it's no guarantee because of the structure of that. So similarly, the syntax here looks very similar, obviously, to the action hooks, except that we're using apply_filters, and the hook name. The value is the value that's being passed in. It's the value that's very important to be passed back, unless we're purposely trying to wipe it out. So for instance, there's a filter on the content in WordPress, and a function, and you get the content in, and you make some kind of string replace, but you don't actually pass that value back. WordPress will think you just purposely wiped out the content. So hook name, the value, again, you can have extra arguments, and that's on the side, that's where the developer's code is who's giving you the hook. And then on our side, we call add filter, again, hook name, then function name, priority, and the number of arguments. So just like for the action hook, if we don't care about the priority and we're only looking at the first argument, we can just stop after those first two parameters. But those other two parameters give us the chance to change the priority. If we want it to happen sooner than other functions, we would put it lower than 10. And if we want it to happen later than other functions, we would put it after 10, or at least after the default. Questions? We'll go through some examples, so. Yes, let's go see some hooks in action. I couldn't resist. So action hook example, I mentioned in queuing scripts. This is one of the first hooks I know I started using, and at the time I didn't really understand that it was a hook. I just knew it was the snippet of code that I used. So right at the top here we have add action, WP and queue scripts. So that's the hook name that I know WordPress has and is looking for me to add my own scripts to the header or the footer of my website. So that's the hook name. I can't change that. That's called by WordPress. But my in-queue styles is my function name. So I have my function here. In this case, it's a child theme. And I'm adding two files to the output of my page on the front end of the site. So the first one I'm adding is the parent style. And the second thing that I'm adding is in this case, a cabin font from Google. So these are, in-queue style is a function that lets me register an in-queue, or just, you can register something and then in-queue it. In this case, I'm just in-queuing it, which does the registration as well. But it lets you add your own files in there. So this is me telling WordPress, hey, I want these other scripts to show up on my front end of my website when a visitor visits my page. So I have my special font that I want to use and my custom styles. In this example, I'm kind of looking at it from a theme standpoint, but plugins that add a front-end functionality to your site are also going to be using the same kind of hook to add their own scripts, JavaScript, CSS, anything that they want to be added to the output of the page. Another example here is footer scripts, so WP_footer. This is, again, a default WordPress hook, and I'm writing my own function called add footer scripts. In this case, this is just a marketing JavaScript tag that I've gotten probably from a third-party affiliate marketing or something like that. And they said, oh, drop this script on your page. And so what I've done here is put a function that essentially outputs that script tag at the WP footer is called at the end of a page. So I don't want it at the top of the page where it's going to take up space. I just want it loaded at the bottom so it doesn't slow down my page. I can put something there. Filter hooks, these are the ones where you can, again, a little more dangerous, but a little more power in that you can alter things. In this case, this kind of dates my presentation, but replacing Trump with Drumpf, we could do that in our content by using the underscore content WordPress filter, and then our function name over here, replace Trump, Drumpf. And then in our content, notice when we did our add filter, we just have the first two parameters. So our priority is 10, which is the default, and we are only expecting one argument because we didn't specify anything different. And then in our function, we're taking the content, we're doing an str replace on it to replace this text, and then all importantly, we're doing this return content so that my altered content goes back. Now, if there isn't any instance of Trump in my text, that's fine. It's just going to return the same content that I had in, but if there were any instances of it, then they would be updated. Another example here, this is for the widget title. I've had to do this on some sites where the client says, oh, I have those, you know, the blog on the side, my widget, and I want the title to link to the actual blog page. So I've put a little hook in here. It goes off of the widget title hook, which is again a WordPress default hook name. And in this case, this is my function name, link posts widget title. And I receive the title as the one parameter, and then I'm checking here, if my title is blog, then I'm actually surrounding that text with a hyperlink to the blog page. And then, again, very important, I'm passing that title back. So if I didn't return that title back, I would just wipe out all of the widget titles, which if you wanted none of your widget titles to show on the page, just the content, that could be perfectly valid. Maybe you just want to use them as a descriptor in the back end, but you don't actually want them to display. You could actually just not return any content. Obviously, you wouldn't need to do this check that I'm doing. In this case, I'm just augmenting the title by turning it into a hyperlink. Okay, before we go to that one, how are we doing? Questions? Makes sense? Yes?
That variable title, is that important?
It is. So that's the data that's being passed in that I have the opportunity to manipulate.
Could you call that variable anything you want to?
I could call it anything I want. So I typically call it the same thing that the developer, when they wrote the hook, is putting in the text. They're often having a variable name. It doesn't matter what you call it. As soon as whatever that first parameter is that's passed in my function, it's going to be called $title. It doesn't matter what it was called anywhere else, and I could name that anything I want. So I want to talk about a specific hook, which is called Preget posts. Actually, probably shouldn't have parentheses there. So the hook name, as we've looked at, is actually just a string. So I've actually made it look like a function name here, so I apologize for that. But Preget posts is a hook that runs after the query object is created for WordPress, but before it's actually run. So anytime you visit a page in WordPress looks at the URL, it looks at the string, and from that it says, oh, for instance, this URL says /category/cats. Oh, I must be pulling blog posts from the cat category. And it writes a query based on that says, I want to pull 10 posts in the cat category. So what this gives you a chance to do is manipulate that query object before it's run. So sometimes you'll see people on pages in WordPress do something where essentially they run another query after they've loaded the default data and shown that instead, but it's much more efficient to just modify the query that's already running on that page to do what you want it to do. And by doing it here, you've done it before the query runs. So you're not running a second time to pull the data. I mean, you might have to query again for other data, but Preget post lets you manipulate that default behavior. And it seems like it should be a filter hook because it does pass the query object in, but as we'll see, we look at it, it's actually an action hook because it uses the query object by reference. So you change the things that happen there and you don't actually have to pass anything back. It's one of the ones to me that always feels kind of confusing because it feels like if I'm modifying the query object, it should be a filter hook, but it's a little deceptive. So an example of this is from the top, I have my add action statement, Preget posts, so that's the hook name. Cat's home filter posts, that's my function. So I'm going to, on my home page, I want to specifically just show cat posts on the front page of my site. I don't want to show any from any other categories, all cats all the time, at least on the home page. So, because cats rule the internet, of course. So here's my function, the name of my function. This query object gets passed in so I can look at it. And then what I'm going to do is, because this function runs, the Preget post hook runs for a bunch of different places. Pretty much anytime you're running a query, it's going to run this function. You want to make really sure you're altering the correct query. So these functions that I'm calling, is main query says, okay, is this the main query for the body of my page? You know, I'm not trying to pull something in the sidebar or the footer, I'm actually pulling the main content. And then is home is saying, is this my blog homepage? Because I don't want to alter every post page on my website that might be showing blog posts. I just want to limit the home page. So once I've ascertained that those things are true, then I'm going to go ahead and set about modifying the query object. So in this case, I'm doing two things. I am setting category name to cats to limit that, and then I'm also going to change my posts per page, which usually defaults to 10, but can be changed in the WordPress settings. I'm going to change that to -1, which means show all posts. So it's great if you're using, in this case, if you want to just make sure you have all the cat posts, although -1 can be dangerous, because if I have 10,000 cat posts, it's going to take a really long time for my web page to load. However, maybe I'm actually using this for, say, a resources page, and I know that I'm only ever going to have, 15 or 20, resources. I could do this. Some people would argue that you probably should never use -1, and it is valid. If you really want to show everything, you could put in 1,000. It's a way. Not using -1 is a way to perhaps be a little safer, so that if for some reason you do actually have 10,000 posts, you avoid it. I typically put -1 in, so maybe do as I say, not as I do. Yes.
So because you're using it inside of the hook, you don't need to do the reset post data, or could you do that anyway?
No, because I'm actually modifying that query object when it's running. So it is the query.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just because I know when you write a custom query
Right.
on a page.
Right, because I'm not running an additional query here. I'm literally just, I'm changing the query that's about to run. So the query object is set up with all of the arguments of the query based on the URL. So WordPress figures out what page I'm on, what kind of content I should be pulling, whether that's a specific page, or in this case, my home page set to blog. I'm pulling, 10 blog posts or whatever, and then I'm modifying that query between the time when it says, here's the query we're going to run, and then running it. So I make a point of showing this hook, because it's one of the more powerful hooks in WordPress. I find that, or it's maybe not one of the most powerful. It's one of the most useful. Say useful. So custom hooks, you can actually write your own hooks, as we saw, just by putting those do action and apply filters calls in. You can put your own hooks in. So if you're a plugin developer, this is a great idea to do. If you're a theme developer and you think people are going to be modifying your theme, this is a great thing to do. There is, I'm sure, a little bit of cost for each hook that you put in that WordPress has to go and see if there's a hook and comes back. But the alternative is that somebody's hacking your code instead, or not able to do what they want. So maybe they're just going to throw your plugin out and go do something else. So it's it's incumbent on the developer to think about where they should be and find the right points. Maybe there's some things you want to make sure they never modify, but in general, I recommend, thinking about where it makes sense to put hooks in. Where might your user want to not go with your defaults and have a little more control? And to avoid any conflicts, you want to make sure that your hook name is unique. So if it's a theme or a plugin, I would definitely prefix that before the text, because if you use very generic text, you could run into, you could conflict with another plugin. Not so much conflict, but I mean, you're going to overlap, and you're going to be running, your hooks are going to be, people who hook into them are not going to be necessarily hooking to the one they want if it's too generic. So you just want to be, if you're actually creating the hook name, you want to make sure that it's as specific as it can be. Since we know that do action and apply filters are the way that these hooks are essentially brought into being, that means also that you can just go searching for them. So you can just do a blatant search in your code. If you search in WordPress core and search for all of the do action apply filters, you've got a great list of things that can be modified. If you are using an IDE, it's really helpful. You can actually go in and look at a function that you know is running in WordPress core or your plugin, and then just scan it yourself for a hook there. So you can, usually the comments are pretty good. You can kind of follow what's going along, and hopefully, crossing your fingers, there's a hook there if you need to actually modify the functioning of the plugin. The other thing about looking them up is that you'll know what kind of data is being passed to you. So you might want to use an action hook, but you'll want to know if the developer puts that hook in, they might also be passing you relevant information about what's happening at the time. So by using an IDE, it's really easy to go in and look at what's actually happening in that function, what the parameters are that are getting passed to you. When I say IDE, does everybody know what an IDE is? No? Great. Sorry. Good. So an IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment, and it's literally just a piece of software where you can create a project out of a set of code, and the application will give you a bunch of benefits from that. It'll do things like syntax check your code, tell you if you're missing semicolons and things like that. It will make it very easy for you to look up functions. So for instance, I use NetBeans, which is a free download. When I'm in a project where I have usually a whole website locally, so I have all the WordPress core code, all my plugin code, I can right-click on a function name and say, go to declaration, and it'll take me, because all the code's in the same project, the piece of software, the IDE, will do all the work for me and take me to that function and show me what's happening there. They'll do things like if you hover over a function, they'll give you the little comment section so you can see what the parameters are, even without going to that file. So it's super helpful if you are going to be writing code. You obviously don't want to be doing it in something like Microsoft Word. People sometimes just use plain text editors. But if you use a program that's an IDE, you just get a whole bunch of benefits to your code. I feel like it helps you write code a lot faster, smarter, and like I said, it will tell you when you're writing it incorrectly, which is great for syntax, especially if you use more than one language. It won't obviously help you fix logic errors that you make, but it can help you avoid the more simple mistakes that we all make from time to time. Some other hook-related functions that we'll just review here just so you know about them. Has filter and has action. As you can imagine, they are just checking for the presence of a function tied to a hook. I don't use those two that often, but it's helpful to know that you could check to see if something's being hooked in. Current filter is going to give you the filter, the hook name of the filter that's running at the moment. So it could be that you have the same function might be attached to more than one hook, because there are ways in WordPress where things happen differently. For instance, if you're adding something new versus saving something existing, sometimes there are different hooks. You might be hooking into two different hooks with the same function. So current filter is a way to find out, oh, well, where am I now? What's happening right now, in case you're doing something slightly different in one of those two instances. doing filter, doing action, did action. These are all Boolean functions where you can check if you're specifically doing, if you're in that particular, in the time period where that hook name is being accessed. So again, if you are particularly helpful if you're using the same function with more than one hook, it's a way to check, oh, is this the filter I'm doing? And then remove filter, remove action, remove all filters, remove all actions. I don't use the plural of this very often, but the remove filter, remove action, I do use a lot as a theme developer. If I am, the most obvious example I can think of, well, first of all, so to remove a filter or action is to go and remove that association that another piece of code has made. So as a theme developer, I can take for instance, a function that the parent theme has tied to a hook, and I can essentially, by calling remove filter, the hook name and that same function and the priority, if there was one, it has to match exactly, I can take that call out of play. And so the time that I use that a lot is sometimes the parent theme has, for instance, a JavaScript file, and it does a bunch of things, and I like 90% of what it does, but it does this one thing that I can't change. It's not perfect, but what I can do is call remove filter or remove action and actually take that file out and then add my own copy of it back in. So I'll take that same JavaScript file, copy it to my child theme, make my edits if there's no other way, and unhook theirs and rehook mine. You'll sometimes see it too. People sometimes take jQuery comes within WordPress and is by default is in-queued in most themes and such. You can choose not to use the jQuery that's inside your WordPress version, which is what it uses by default. Sometimes people choose to use jQuery that's up on Google or another cloud library, and they do that because it's on a different server. So it's a file. The way the HTTP works, you can only have 6 connections at a time to pull files. So if you're pulling jQuery from your site as well as your styles and everything, by saying, I don't want to pull the jQuery on my site, I want to pull this jQuery up here in the cloud, you've both transferred that file to come from somewhere else so it can happen at the same time. And you also have the possibility that that jQuery library was called on another site, and so it's already cached for that user, that they've maybe already used that. So remove filter, remove action. Again, often when I'm doing child themes, those are really helpful to take out things that are happening and essentially then add my own version of it. So these are a bunch of, when you get to the slides, these actually are all hyperlinked, but these are the code reference pages on these critical functions. So the do action, add action, and apply filters, add filter. And then some other general references about how the hook action filter reference list, how those all work, and also specifically on Preget posts, because I feel like it's a very important, useful, powerful hook. Now you know enough to get into your own mischief with hooks. Yeah, so again, the slides are there, and I think we still have time, so we have time for questions and such, because it's early. Huh?
The mood lighting up, how good seeing you.
The illustration.
I'm not sure. I stole it online somewhere. Shh. Is anybody already using hooks?
I did years ago.
Yeah.
Years ago.
Yeah? And you are?
I do it through Genesis.
Yeah, Genesis you use a lot of hooks.
Yeah.
So, I have a question.
Yes.
If you have a header on a website, and you want part of that header to disappear on other pages, can that be done with hooks, or does that have to be something like JavaScript?
I guess it depends on what it is that needs to be hidden. sometimes that's something that can be just done with CSS
Okay.
because your body tag has so many tags in there about most themes. When you look in the body tag that's on your page, if you view source, it has all sorts of tags to tell you what page you're on. So like a page ID or a category ID or a single post, it'll tell you exactly what kind of page it is. So if it's its own element and you just want to hide it, but if you want to keep it, if you want to change content or make it maybe a whole thing not appear, because hiding it still means you're loading it. So if it's like a video, like you probably don't want to load it. You actually want to keep it from showing. And in that case, a hook could be the case. It depends how it's being put in.
Right.
So if it's maybe done in a widget, you could be filtering on the widget maybe and pulling out the content. It really depends how it gets there in the first place. So you have to kind of understand how it's getting there so you can figure out how to hook in.
I see.
Yes.
Earlier you said, I don't even remember the exact words you used, but you referenced a resource that you downloaded that you found helpful. But I didn't know if there was a name to it or something you look up.
So if you're using an IDE, I mean, you can look up your functions and see what they're doing. I'm not sure about a list, although these plugin API action reference, filter reference, I believe that those list all of the, here, let's just check it. I think that they list the WordPress hooks. If you go down, yeah, actions run during a typical request. So when you scroll down this, it gives you, these are all different hook names that are run. So MU plugins loaded, registered taxonomy, registered post type, setup theme, after setup theme. So that's actually when you initialize a theme. So yeah, these are kind of references where you can see what a bunch of the standard hooks are. So if you're looking for something and you maybe don't have an IDE or you're not comfortable hunting around in the code, this is a place where you could check because it's also got a nice description of what each hook does. So one of the things you can see here is you probably can't see that, it's so tiny, but there. The template redirect is another really powerful hook. It lets you alter which file WordPress is going to use to show that page. So if you want to actually on the fly change out which template file is being used, that's a way that you can do that. Yes.
Is there a reference with like the chronological order of these all moments?
I feel like this might actually be chronological. Let me see if it says at the top. So this hasn't been updated in a little while, so it may not be thoroughly complete. They had WordPress had the codex for a while, and then they switched over to like the developer's handbook, but there's a lot of things that are in the codex that don't seem to have ever made it over. So this specifically says, these actions are called when a logged in user opens the home page in version 3.3.1. So it's not necessarily a complete list, but it is roughly in order. Yeah, so, yeah, and some of these it depends, like get footer, get sidebar, that just depends where. Yeah, well, again, this has not been updated in a little while, but it gives you an idea still. Yeah, and it can be tricky sometimes to find what hook you want to modify, but again, as you get more comfortable in the code, if you're using an IDE, you should be able to, kind of start following the trail of where there might be a hook, and then look for those, do action, apply filters.
Can you pass your own variables and parameters to an action?
Well, you can't, because it's the developer whose code you're trying to edit who's actually created that action or filter hook. No, because they're passing you whatever they decided to pass you, if they were even nice enough to put a hook in, which you hope they were. Unfortunately, you don't always have control over that. Yeah, it's up to them to leave you the hooks, and then it's up to you to find them and use them. A lot of places, a lot of plugins that are well supported and well documented will have a list of hooks. I use Gravity Forms on a lot of sites, and they have a really great documentation where they have all of their hooks in there, and they even give little examples about how to modify them, and so you can get in there and do a lot of back-end customization. And I just mentioned that as an example, but other plugins like that have strong documentation will often have, a list of hooks that you can modify. So it's great, even if, you said you're a designer, so you're probably not writing a lot of hooks, but if you did a little digging, you might be able to tell your developer, like, oh, I think there's a hook to change this. Maybe we can work at it that way. And it's just hunting and pecking and trying, try again. If there's more than one argument passed, you've got to make sure that when you're making that add action or add filter call, that you're including that priority in the number of arguments. Otherwise, you just won't get them. You'll think you're getting them. You might have them there in your function, but they won't actually be passed unless you make sure to include those third and fourth parameters.